In the world of geopolitics, where nations thrive for power and dominance, the South China Sea dispute sets the stage for a high-stakes game of strategy. In recent years, China has transformed over 3,200 acres of the South China Sea into artificial islands equipped with military bases, runways, and missile systems. Yet this move is nothing but a tiny fragment of the larger geopolitical game that is in play right now. So, let's dive into the details of the conflict. The South China Sea is a region rich in oil and gas, abundant in fish, and home to some of the busiest shipping lanes on the planet. But this dispute isn't just about territorial claims, it's about power, natural resources, and global dominance. But what makes it valuable for these countries? The South China Sea's significance lies in its abundant natural resources and strategic location, the two main aspects that make any region invaluable. It holds vast reserves of oil and gas, estimated between 10 to 130 billion barrels and 190 to 900 trillion cubic feet, respectively. It is also among the busiest waterways in the world, with over 21% of global trade amounting to over $3.3 trillion, and more than half of the world's fishing vessels operate in this area. Therefore, free access through the South China Sea is incredibly important, not only to the countries around it, but also to countries like Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, and India. No wonder the countries are battling over this for decades, but the most shocking claim comes from China positioning itself with the 9-dash line through which it extends its dominance over approximately 90% of the South China Sea. The 9-dash line, also called the cow's tongue, first appeared on maps in the 1930s. Originally, it was 11 dashes, but was later revised to 9 in the 1950s. Soon after creating the 9-dash line, China entered into a war with Japan, and at the same time, China was also fighting a civil war. Eventually, the communist forces won this civil war, and the new Communist People's Republic of China adopted the 9-dash line. The nationalist forces, who lost the civil war, retreated to Taiwan. They brought with them the same territorial claims of the Republic of China, including the 9-dash line. This is why Taiwan also claims the same territory today. Now, the problem with this is that this line extends up to 2,000 kilometers from the Chinese mainland, including the Paracel Islands, Spratly Islands, and Scarborough Shoal. Although largely uninhabited, the Paracels and the Spratlys are said to have reserves of natural resources around them. Spratly Islands are claimed by China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei. The Paracel Islands are controlled by China, but claimed by Vietnam and Taiwan. Over the last decades, China's actions in the South China Sea have become much more assertive. But it received a massive blow in 2016 when the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague ruled against China's claims, stating there was no legal basis for the 9-dash line. Despite this, China didn't step back and has rejected the ruling. It still continues to assert its claims, escalating the maritime issues. Moving on, before diving into more details, let's first zoom in more closely on the South China Sea region map. Here you can find hundreds of little islands, reefs, and rocks scattered all across the sea in several major groupings. Ever wondered why those tiny islands in the South China Sea are causing such a big fuss? Let me break it down for you. Controlling the South China Sea is all about owning islands and reefs. These land masses that you are seeing aren't just specks on the map. They're like legal gold mines. According to international law, owning these islands lets countries claim a big chunk of the surrounding sea as their own. It's called an exclusive economic zone, or EEZ for short. And guess what? Within that zone, they get first dibs on all the oil, gas, and fish. EEZ extend up to 200 nautical miles around a country's territory. But it's not just about fishing and drilling. These islands are also like military strongholds. Whoever controls these islands can control the sea. So countries are racing to claim as many islands as they can. Why? Because whoever controls these islands not only gets hold on immense wealth, but also gains a huge advantage in any potential conflicts. It's because once you own an island, you can have your own army bases right in the middle of the ocean. However, the number of islands is very limited, which is why, in 2013, China started working on constructing artificial islands capable of sustaining large military bases and even deep water ports. This move from China has shifted the whole dynamics, but it's not alone in this fight for dominance. Other nations, including Taiwan, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia, Brunei, lay claim to these same waters. And then we also have the United States, Indonesia, India, and other nations like Singapore, etc., which don't directly have any claim, but are involved due to their proximity or national interests in the region. There are in total 6 nations which assert direct claims over the sea, namely Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Philippines, China, and Taiwan. Starting with Vietnam, it is argued that many islands and reefs were traditionally used by Vietnamese fishermen for centuries and submitted the official claim along with Malaysia to the United Nations in 2009. It is also stated that these islands were formally incorporated into Vietnam during the French colonial period. On the other hand, Malaysia's claim was based more on the continental shelf principle, which allows the country to add up to 350 nautical miles of the submerged area that extends from the coastlines of Malaysia to the EEZ. However, Malaysia's claim includes some of the Spratly Islands, overlapping with Vietnam's claim. Malaysia argues that these islands were part of the Japanese Empire until 1945, after which Japan renounced its claims, allowing Malaysia to annex some of them. The Philippines also claims several islands in the South China Sea, overlapping with the claims of Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei. Coming to countries not part of direct claims, first comes Indonesia. Indonesia keeps mentioning it doesn't claim the South China Sea, but also keeps clashing with China over the Natuna Islands. That's because China's 9-dash line overlaps with what Indonesia considers its own waters. Moving on to Singapore, it doesn't actually claim any part of the sea, but it relies heavily on it for economic and financial reasons. The thing is, Singapore's success is closely dependent on free access to this waterway. Now, Singapore has good relations with its neighbors and China. But here's the catch. It's in Singapore's best interest to make sure no single power controls the South China Sea. Why? Because that could ruin its economic game plan. India, Japan, and the United States are all stepping up their game in the South China Sea as well. India's introduced Act East policy. The goal of it was to forge stronger security ties with countries in the region and major players like Japan and the US. India's major interest in the conflict is due to the Strait of Malacca. Why? For one, it's a major trading route for India in the Asia-Pacific. Second, India wants to push back against China's dominance in the region, especially since they've had border beef since the 1950s. Japan, on the other hand, is also teaming up with the US. Their reasons are pretty similar to that of India's. To explain it in short, Japan's economy relies heavily on South China Sea access, with tons of its energy imports, which is around 70%, passing through the region. Moreover, many Japanese firms are engaged into oil and gas exploration in the area, and thereby have collaborated with countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines. Japan has strained relations with respect to China due to the territorial disputes over Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea and the status of Taiwan. And then there's the United States. They've been building their presence in the South China Sea big time since the 2010s. They're basically building a coalition against China, teaming up with various countries in the region to keep China's ambitions in check. Additionally, they're conducting freedom of navigation operations, cruising through areas China claims as its own, but the US sees as fair game. Unlike India and Japan, the US's motivations are less about economics and more about keeping the peace in a region that's heating up. With so many players in the mix, the question is, why is China so determined to assert its control even at the risk of provoking conflict? For China, the answer lies in its vision of becoming a maritime power, one that spans not just the Pacific, but also the Indian Ocean. If we draw parallels to historical events, China's rise mirrors that of the United States in the 19th century, particularly in terms of seeking dominance over a strategically important sea region. However, unlike the Caribbean, where the U.S. successfully established dominance over smaller and easily influenced nations, the South China Sea is home to countries like Vietnam and Malaysia, which are strong contenders. For decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. has not had any strong geopolitical rival. As China aims to become the world's leading power by 2049 and expands its global reach through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, tensions between the two countries are on the rise, and the U.S. is now seeing China as a geopolitical rival, a position which was vacant for several decades. Thereby, the United States has stepped up its presence in the South China Sea. This move is part of a broader strategy to curb China's growing influence. In recent times, Chinese Coast Guard ships have frequently deployed water cannons against Philippine vessels, as a result of which Philippine ships were damaged and the sailors were injured. Philippines President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. has addressed this and also raised concerns over potential escalation in the South China Sea during the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore. He warned that any willful act involving the death of a Filipino citizen at the hands of another country could be perceived as an act of war. To conclude, all we can say is that the South China Sea dispute has all the major players in the world, from China, USA, to India, engaged actively, all trying to assert their dominance, and any small incident can have a huge impact on the global peace and stability. That's all for video. Feel free to share your thoughts on this in the comments section below.